if you were transitioning a hospital, I won't step on Foster's line, the hospital, so let's say that two independent hospitals are acquired by a regional chain or a large national chain, and they agree to acquire it, and they agree to acquire the medical records first, so that the medical records office stays open and people get their charts. They then are the steward of that, not to pick a chain, and they then could obviously use those addresses that would be considered appropriate. We got a ruling on that, to send to the community where, there'll be no interruption. We're taking over the Scott Family Hospital in town. Our doctors groups are your doctors, blah, blah. So there are ways which make the Jerry Seelig notion that giving this data to another greater fool, sometimes a greater fool isn't a greater fool. So that would, but you've known that and you've done that. So that's why, once again, you don't want to be in that room with Charlie Hicks trying to figure out what to do with the boxes.
If I could just answer one additional comment. Jerry brings up a good point, and obviously in a fiduciary role as either a trustee or a receiver, we're trying to create recoveries. I can tell you in the manner under which Jerry described the opportunity to transfer that information, it wasn't done with the expectation of any kind of money. It was done really with the ability to kind of shift responsibility. And that's really what it comes down to, mostly when it comes to records, is instead of trying to monetize it for the sake of helping someone kind of open a existing facility under a new name and being able to kind of send lists out to say, please come visit us at the same location you used to do, we're open for business. It's more about the protection of the data such that it's available to the public longer term. So the win for us as a fiduciary is that we don't have to be saddled with the responsibility of its maintenance and care over a longer term. And the win is obviously one where we're all too happy to let someone else manage it and take on the responsibility for its custodialship. So, this is where I come in, and I want to first say, the chart that, or the pyramid that Ben and his team, or Bo and his team created are really excellent in the sense that it very much drives what I do from a practical perspective. As a receiver, as a trustee, as a financial advisor, we're very much the front line of trying to get involved in these things. And I've tried to illustrate 3 different examples that perhaps can drive the rest of the conversation associated with, scenarios where data became a big thing. As we were involved in the engagements. Ironically, in the 2 that are highlighted at the top, I'll talk to them a little bit more specifically, but I do want to let you know, and in the context of running a hospital, the 2 things that the one thing I was terrified by and the one thing I made the front page of the USA Today on are completely different. The first thing I was terrified on is that someone under my watch would ultimately have a horrible mishap health-wise. And thankfully, that's where Jerry and I got to know each other, and ultimately we were a good team, and he protected my backside. We had no such issue. What ultimately landed me on the front page of the USA Today was a dispute between the private equity lender and the requirements of the court to make available the 200,000 patient files that I had within my possession, such that the public could gain access to them. And so what happened was an individual, a woman who ultimately, a young lady who needed her files to address a critical health issue, I didn't have the means, nor did I have the opportunity to be able to provide her with that patient record. And so therefore she went to the local paper. The local paper happened to be connected to Gannett. Gannett took it and made it the front page of the USA Today as a result of woman in Arizona is potentially going to die over dispute related to access to medical records on failed hospital. So if you can imagine the scenarios under which I ultimately stay awake at night, that wasn't one I anticipated going into this, but it was absolutely the one that I think we're responding to and have done so correctly. But I'll tell a little bit more about that story. Something similar happened in the student data case where we got asked in the Obama days, if you recall, there was a large national concern about trying to manage and or hold accountable some of these for-profit entities that ultimately did these career colleges. And we got the Arizona contingent of a bankruptcy that actually had 6 campuses in Arizona. We ultimately were brought in mid-semester. We had to ultimately educate, a number of thousand of students that essentially, they would not be able to finish their semester as planned. We inherited 6 campuses, and with that came 25,000 student files. In much the same example as the medical scenario, the biggest concern I had going in was that somehow I would just not be able to sleep at night because these individuals ultimately weren't able to fulfill their educational dreams. What ultimately became the biggest, kind of problem for me was the ability to get their student files to them so that they could transfer on and go pursue their educational pursuits somewhere else, because there's not a clear and defined process for that. So again, it goes to highlight the importance of the data component. And then lastly, in any takeover that I typically get involved in, it always involves some degree of an enterprise. So there's an operating component to it. And in general context, we were talking about it just in our prep work for this particular presentation. Many people disregard the amount of information that's held by an employer. You're always concerned about LifeLock, and they're going to get you through this, and you're going to get your credit card information and all that kind of stuff. And you never want to give, and Bo is more of an expert on this, but you never want to give your addresses, your social security number, and your date of birth. Guess who's got every bit of that information? It's all sitting in a file at your employer. And if that employer goes out of business, what is the protection for you? And quite honestly, I'm not aware of any outside of just an ethical issue that I've always taken as it relates to ensuring that that information is ultimately held in a secure location and or destroyed with the order of a court. But that is likely one of the easiest places for anyone wanting to do harm to find information about individuals that could ghost personalities or what have you. So, those are the 3 areas that I wanted to talk to related to giving you some practical examples of case studies. The one other thing that I'll dive into related to the medical data that I think is important. So as I referenced, we were brought in to be the receiver of a company that was formerly in bankruptcy. Jerry got involved at that level prior to my involvement as a PCO. He had ultimately been with the companies. They were 2 hospitals that merged in a bankruptcy to become one entity before it was ultimately asked for me to become the receiver over. The interesting part is the note was bought by a private equity firm after the first bankruptcy. That was ultimately the plaintiff that asked for my appointment. And ironically, shortly after we got involved with the expectation that we were going to be running these hospitals for a smooth transition to another operator that was previously identified, and that we were the stopgap measure to allow the 120 days for the state regulatory body to transfer the license, turned out to be within very short order. We presented a funding request because the mounting financial obligations of the entities that we inherited were horribly insolvent. And we needed cash infusion to simply be able to make the very basic necessities associated with life and safety, and not to mention patient care. Conversations broke down over the funding of that monies, and then we were forced to essentially go through the emergency checklist of what to do when you decommission a hospital, which isn't what it was ever advertised to be. There was no circumstance under which I was ever brought into this thinking that I was going to be turning a hospital or 2 hospitals off. It was always with the expectation that we were literally going to be good stewards and manage it from one operator to the next. So thankfully, again, I had Jerry by my side, but that's where these patient issues came to be.